The only one I needed to see is not here. That's okay. All right. So I think we're just going to get this show on the road and keep it rolling because with just two of you, we'll just do it. And then, and I'll try not to knock the...
Oh, I have a question.
Oh, you do?
Our three references from the literature review that we were doing for the research proposal.
Yes.
Okay. I was watching the video over, and you said you wanted an APA style submission.
Yeah.
And I did an APA style references submission, but I didn't know if you meant like have a proposal, like a cover page in APA style.
No. You didn't have to have a cover page. Oh, no. You're okay. I don't. And in fact, I'm not a big fan of cover pages in general, but that's fine. For students, I know that it's difficult. It's like, okay, fine. Well, she doesn't want a cover page, but she does want everything else. What's going on, you know? So the truth is, when I talk about APA, what I'm interested in is your in-text citations and your bibliography. That's what I'm interested in, that you're getting your in-text citations right, you're using the right format, and that your bibliography is formatted correctly. That's really all I'm interested in. You should always, there's a couple of people that I've written on the data analysis or the midterm exams, you know, don't use colored font, don't use weird type, you know, APA is 12 point Times New Roman type, you know, with a, you know, yeah, and then, and that's it, you know, 1.5 or 2 spaced, you know, so just stay with that. The more you get used to that, the better it is. Yeah. No creativity, damn it. None at all. We don't want creativity. It's a bad thing. All right. Okay, so we're now in week 9. So how is the proposal going? Everybody okay with that?
I'm probably going to want to visit with you about it, but I'm okay for right now.
Okay. Lupe, I need to visit with you anyway, so I'll talk to you a bit later. All right. So I realized that I messed up the weeks on the syllabus. So next week we actually need to be doing chapter 12 instead of chapter 11. This is just an FYI, because obviously I'll be giving you a lecture next week on chapter 12, but it's because the final data analysis, which I'll also be handing out. In order to do that final data analysis the most effectively as possible, you need to have the information in chapter 12 rather than chapter 11. Okay? Did you guys do the survey? How'd you do on your survey, Diego?
I was primarily visual, introverted, and metaphorical.
Oh.
The big 3 that I remember. I also remember reading that most people in general are visual, or they like writing things down does help with cognitive.
Right, function, yeah.
Even if you're, you know, an audio studier. So I feel like for that part specifically, even though that was my result and I think it matches, so do most other people. Right.
No, it's true that I like to write things down. If I've got something to try and work out with a student, I will start writing it down so I can see it on the page.
I did like some of the more specific ones, like it was talking about, do you like visual things, like when the professor writes on the board? I actually do prefer that. So I like the inclusion of that.
Okay. And you guys, did you do the survey?
Yes.
How did you come out, Mark?
There were no surprises.
There were no surprises. All right. You know yourself pretty well.
Yeah. What was interesting was that in some of the categories, I was very dramatically towards one characteristic. And then in some of the others, I was almost even.
Okay.
So I wrote on the little discussion post, I think it's a good tool, and I want to remember it and hang on to it and perhaps even use it in classes
Yeah, good.
as a diagnostic tool.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
But I also think it's useful to remember that I think that people's learning style can change over time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that as people get older, their learning style might change. And I think that even on a shorter time sample, your learning style might change a little bit from day to day and week to week.
Mm-hmm.
Not dramatically, but slightly.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there might be some times when certain learning style characteristics could really depend on your mood, how you're feeling physically, and all kinds, and your classroom environment. You know, whether you're comfortable or not.
Yeah, I think it can also depend on the material that you have to work on.
Right,
You
because
know.
I also wrote that even though I was like very introverted on that question, were they measuring introvert, extrovert? I was introvert, wasn't surprised at all. But I'm more tolerant of collaborative things in a language class because of the nature of the topic.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I said in the post, it's just like, if I'm in a history class or philosophy class, don't put me in a group.
Don't put you in a group.
Actually.
Yeah.
But in language, I get it. It's like, okay, it's different.
Yeah, well, because part of it is the input-output thing, right? But I have noticed that a lot of students in other things, like I was listening to some students in line for coffee who were complaining that in their economics classes put them in groups.
Yeah.
And the last thing they want to do is work. But I sort of get that too, because it's like, you know, if you're going to work in a business, you've got to be able to work with the people around you, right? So, you know, I mean, you've got to learn how to, you know, navigate that situation, I suppose. So anyway, Tolalupe, how did you do?
I mentioned in the reading post.
Yeah.
Two things actually came to the forefront for me.
Yeah.
Which are age and the environment.
Ah.
And that it doesn't matter whether you like, even if it's like practically the people you call that they are the life of the
life of the party, an extrovert.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
They have this
Introvert?
No. They have this behavioral. They call them something I've forgotten. Somebody that is hyperactive. They have this categories for that. Like if you say you're choleric or you're.
Oh, okay, melancholic, choleric.
Oh, I don't know what. Yes, I think we get the general idea though. Yeah.
So you know, but that your like what I wrote. I said your environment may condition you to actually keep quiet. If you, if you live in an environment where, like I say, that the United States, you know, the way I view it is that you are allowed to actually express yourself irrespective of who you are, you know, and I think that's one of the fundamental things that you hold on to, that, okay, there's freedom of speech and all of that. But when you live in an environment where, you know, I remember that growing up, we had military regime where my parents would warn me before even going out, that I don't go into saying, you know, so you don't want to say things that will put you in trouble or will put your family in trouble. So as a matter of fact, you get to it. And there is this, people will say, we respect people a lot, like Africans. It is not like we are subservient or we see ourselves as slaves or something, but it's just the culture. The culture is, if you see somebody that's older than you, you respect the person.
So we respect them, yeah.
So people may not understand, you know. So, but if we are to assess this extrovert introversion in my environment, they'll be able to. There may be a clear-cut, you know, difference. So I'm an introvert or you're an introvert, because that is the environment, and we understand perfectly what the environment, you know.
Yeah, what requirements of the environment. Yeah.
But what I'm talking about in a larger context here, you know, it will be that, oh, she's introverted because of where she's coming from, or she's an extrovert because of where she's coming from. So I did say that, and I said that age also. As you grow older, there's some things you don't want to. You just keep quiet and just listen more and learn more, rather than just, you know, trying to.
Mark and I are looking at you like, yeah. Yeah, when you get to a certain age, you're just like, well, can't fix that problem, so got nothing to say about that. All right, good. Well, I'm glad. Well, obviously everyone had a lot of fun with that. That's good. So I'm looking forward to read that. I just finished grading everybody's everything. So now I'll get a chance to look at the surveys. So today we're going to do chapter 10 and the reading post. Now I know as you read chapter 10, it's pretty dense. So we're going to sort of go through some of the stuff that you need to be taken out of that chapter, and the rest of it you can sort of let go. But basically, processing theories, what this book has done has divided two sets of context for how we develop language learning in a second language. One through interlanguage work. One is through processing factors, so what we basically call psycholinguistic factors, and the other one is social factors. So the next chapter that we'll look at in a couple of weeks is social factors, so things like task variation and so on. This chapter is all about processes from the brain, essentially psycholinguistic processing. So hang on to that as we go through. That's what all this thing is. So once we accept the notion of stable transitional grammars, which I note from your midterms you all now have accepted and can happily discuss, the next question is what drives these processes, right? So as I say, in this chapter, they focus on what might be driving those processes in terms of the brain. And then the following one, they focus on what might be driving these approaches in terms of things like social context, the kind of thing that Tolalupe was just talking about, task variation and so on. So essentially what they do in this chapter is try and cover pretty much every processing theory that's come along between the 1970s and 2017. So some of them are quite old, like the one we'll start with, the Pieneman processing theory has been around since the 1970s and 80s. And then some of them, like these new emergentist models that we're not really going to cover, are very new. And this is not work that I have actually done, so I'm no expert in psycholinguistics. So it's really just to give you an idea of what it's moving forward to. And if you wanted to do advanced second language acquisition seminars or advanced psycholinguistics, then that's the places that you would do that in. Okay. So the first one is literally called processability theory, and this is Pieneman from Australia. And what you'll see is a lot of things that sound familiar, right? So that there's a linguistic processor, he says, but his idea of a linguistic processor is not the same as a nativist's idea of a linguistic processor, right? So a nativist, meaning a Chomskyan perspective, would say that the linguistic processor was this language acquisition device, right? This black box that we don't know, but that gets turned on, and you know. But anybody that's really working from a general cognitive perspective thinks that whatever the linguistic processor is, it goes right along with all our other cognitive functions, and it doesn't need to be a nativist kind of model. Who is that? Is that me? No. Okay, so comprehensibility and production of language forms rely on the processor, which itself follows developmental processes. Again, it's this idea of an acquisition order, but it's not the same as Krashen's, right? Because what's Krashen's based on?
Grammar. And probably.
Which bit? No, you were right the first one, but what's Krashen? What's Krashen's theory based on?
Well, those behaviors.
Krashen was UG, right? Krashen was the guy that was like, let's base this all on Chomsky and stuff, right? So again, you've got this idea of a developmental order, but not the same idea of what it is or where it comes from as Krashen's idea, right? So this is going to happen a lot. That what you'll see is very similar concepts, but theoretically, they're coming from entirely different places. And that's the important point, right? So if we look at the processability theory, it's got something called an implicational hierarchy. And the best thing I can do to show you that is to show you that. So 254 is where you want to be in your book. So this is an example of questions. We've seen this a couple of times, right? This idea of developmental order in questions. So this one is taking you through developmental order of questions. Start with single words, what, single units, and when they say single units, they mean chunks, right? So that would just be a chunk. What is your name that they would have learned? Then we get to SVO, so movement from your cat is black, you have a cat, right? Then we get fronting words, which means the WH words or do questions, and so it goes on, right? And then eventually we get to the sort of really difficult stuff, the negative questions and the inversions and so on. So the idea of this is what they call an implicational hierarchy. So you can't learn 2 until you've learned 1. And you don't learn 3 until you've learned 2. Do you see what I mean? So the order of the development comes from what learners learn. A really famous one is, what am I trying to say? Relative clauses. So we start with easy relative clauses like subject relative clauses, and then in English we go all the way to indirect object relative clauses, and that's at the end, right? So basically you can't go from 0 to indirect object clauses. You have to go through subject clauses, direct object clauses first, and that's what we mean by implication. If you could do an indirect object relative clause, you should be able to do a subject relative clause. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's the same idea in terms of, yes, there's a development, and yes, we can see it happening over time. But as I say, the difference is where it might be coming from. Okay, not a nativist model, but a general cognitive model. Now you'll notice one thing that this model shows you in the page is a very linear progression, right? You've got stage 1, the implicational hierarchy is very linear. You've got stage 1, and if once you've done stage 1, you can do stage 2 and so on. And in fact, that's not exactly how it works, right? Of course, it's going to be way more messy than that. So the person that really got into that part of it is McLaughlin, who did informational restructuring. And what he basically says is the linear approach doesn't work really well because it's not, okay, so you have a system. Diego has his system, and to his system he adds subject relative clauses, and then his system's still going, and then he adds direct object relative clauses, system still going, right? What McLaughlin said was each time you add something, everything gets restructured, right? So everything gets a bit more complicated. So rather than just adding subject relative clauses, then object relative clauses, by the time you get to add in the object relative clause, everything else has started to change a little bit in order to accommodate this new grammar, okay? So that's what we mean by restructuring, okay? That the whole system, you don't just keep adding things, adding things, adding things. As you add things, the system starts to change. Someone just threw themselves against the wall. Okay. So also he was very interested in the idea of automaticity. So again, automaticity to you might sound similar to the idea of acquisition, right? Because what was the two things that crashed? One was acquisition and one was learning. Good. And what was the difference between the two?
You have to think about automaticity.
Right. Which one?
Acquisition.
Acquisition. Good. Good. Well done. And you got that right on the exam too. Awesome. So acquisition was the thing that was automatic, right? And he was trying to get all of us to do, because if we learned, it went through the monitor and everything else, right? So it's this similar idea of being able to do something, but it's not, it's the same notion of ease of production, but it doesn't come from the same place as Krashen's idea of acquisition. Yeah? So we're talking about concepts that are sort of very similar, but they're called different names and they come up at different ways because they're embedded in a particular theory. And that particular theory has certain ideas of how things are done. So the biggest difference here between, for example, McLaughlin and Pieneman is that they don't begin from a place where there's a nativist language acquisition device. They begin from a place where all processing takes place in a similar way. So if you identify declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge for general cognition, you do the exact same thing for language. There's no reason to think of language learning as any different from, you know, learning to play tennis or having a car, you know, learning to drive a car. Automaticity of knowledge is the idea that, you know, you don't think about where your feet are, right? In a car, you just sort of, if you have to do an emergency stop, you just stop. So that kind of idea of the same way that you do that is the general cognition that's involved in language learning. So basically, the more that can be produced automatically, the more you can free up space. And again, we don't need to know, you don't need to know the ins and outs of it unless you decide to do your research paper on this. If you don't decide to do your research paper on this, you don't need to know all the bits and pieces. But you do need to recognize the fact that this is what makes these approaches different from a nativist approach. Oh, so here I got ahead of myself. Restructuring, each time new information is added to the system gets shifted around, right? So there's some discontinuity in perceived learning. Now you saw this exact example when we did data analysis 1, when it looked like in time 1, that kid could produce perfect questions, you remember? And then in time 2 and 3, the perfect questions started getting wrong. You realize that in time 1, actually, she or he, I can't remember, didn't know how to make perfect questions. They were just using chunks. Then by time 2 and 3, then they're trying to analyze those chunks, right? So the learner, you saw the use of chunks. What do you do, doggy, I think, or what do you do, Snoopy, or whatever, in which the learner has to restructure the entire chunk to take out the you and put in the new third person. What does the boy do, right? Not what do you do, the boy, okay? So that's what they mean by restructuring the whole system, right? One thing leads to another thing. And that's called discontinuity. I can never say that, discontinuity hypothesis, which means that you're not going to see this gradual fabulousness of a linear progression. So if we look at the linear progression we had here in Pianeman, although overall we can say they're going through these stages, that's not what your learner's language is going to look like, right? Your learner's language is gonna go up and then back down and then a little bit up and then a little bit down, and over time go through those stages. So they give you another nice example of that on page 260. This time with negatives, right? So what's the difference between time 1 and time 2?
Contractions.
Good. So in time 2, there's this realization that there's a don't. And instead of no go, don't, but I am don't run shows that they still think of don't as the negative marker. They don't realize it's the do plus the not, right? And then what's happening between time 2 and time 3?
They realize that, well, partially, they say.
Yeah.
Look and don't run.
Yeah, they're getting there, right? And in time 4, there's sort of some sense in which they've worked out the don't go, we've still got don't run, but we've still got I am don't run, which means that there's obviously still a problem with breaking down that marker, that do plus not, right? So this is what is also being called destabilization or U-shaped learning, something that we typically expect in language learners. So it's the result of restructuring. So again, think of your first data analysis. We assume by the end of it they're going to get there. The perception that something's been learned, but then is in fact added to the system. It hasn't been learned, but then it is added to the system, which is the bottom of the U, and relearn correctly as part of the restructured system that brings it to the top of the U. So you can see those U's on page 262 and 263. Okay. So the idea is stage 1 might sound right, but actually it's a chunk or it's something you can't analyze it. You don't know exactly what you're doing. So you go down time 2 to where you begin to work out where you should be using something and not using something, which now looks like you're making a mistake, right? But then you go back up, you've integrated that into your restructured system. Now when you get it right at stage 3, you're really getting it right, meaning it's not an unanalyzed chunk, but you've actually restructured the system. Does that make any sense? Yeah. So this is something that as teachers we really want to think about, because we often say, oh, you know, I taught you that. How come you don't know the present continuous? I taught you the present continuous, right? It's more complicated than that linear progression, right? They might be trying to integrate the present continuous into what it is that they already have, and that causes destabilization in the system. So everything kind of looks bad for a while, and then it comes back around to the top. So what does that mean? It means that one thing that's super important in teaching is to revisit things, is to go around and come back to things. Because when you come back to it the second time or the third time, the system may have restructured enough that it makes a lot more sense that time, and they'll be more successful at achieving that goal than they were the first time. So if you're looking, for example, at textbooks or at curriculum, good curricula and good textbooks do that. They take you around. They cover one thing more than one time. So they don't just have, you know, chapter 1 can and cannot, you know, chapter 2 this, chapter 3. They constantly have exercises and ways in which you can recycle concepts that have already come in to make sure that you give that concept a chance to function within a restructured system. So from a teaching point of view, that's the most important thing for you to remember. If you're looking at a textbook or curricula and there's no discussion of revisiting anything, you know, it's just all new material, then that's less likely to be successful for your learner. It also means that you as a teacher are going to have to start putting that revisiting in order to give your learners the best chance of success. Any questions so far? Okay. So more recent constructs. So all this back thing here on processing theory was basically all done in the 1980s and 90s. Okay, I mean, still being done, but it's the first sort of go around in terms of psycholinguistic processes. So things that are happening in the brain with second language learning. It's the first go around on that idea with these models. It's what I grew up with, was destabilization and U-shaped learning. So I'm a big fan. More recent constructs come from psychology, and particularly there's a lot of attention paid now to attention and working memory. So do you guys have you had any introduction elsewhere to attention and working memory? Okay, talk to me, Diego. You say yes?
Psych undergrad.
You're a psych undergrad. So tell us all about attention and working memory, Diego.
Well, working memory particularly used to be thought in the past as like your short-term memory.
Good.
But it's really a bad way of looking at it, because it's not a limited amount of memory that we have, but rather the tools that we use actively to keep information at the forefront of our mind. So like phone numbers, we do this thing called repeating, where we just repeat the phone number in our heads a lot so that we can remember it shortly. And as soon as you write it down, after somebody tells it to you, you stop repeating it and then you forget it.
Yep.
So that's an example of short-term memory.
An example, in fact, that they use here too. Yeah, that's an example of working memory. Good. Yeah. Attention.
I don't remember what the big
deal was.
Attention was.
Yeah. Well, attention, and basically in psychology, there's focal attention and peripheral attention. So it's wherever your sort of brain is going, and there's a lot of stuff about that. And we literally have, like, you know, sucked this stuff out of psychology and decided to see how it works for second language acquisition. And the idea of attention is that if you're not attending to input, it doesn't matter how much input you get, it's not going to do anything, right? So in general terms, this is the psychology sort of definition. You're ready to receive stimuli. You direct your attention or your resources to that stimulus, and thus you then register that stimulus, and hopefully it becomes intake, right? So, for example, I don't know if they mentioned this study in here or I've taken it from somewhere else, but there was a study a while ago on kids, and pre-kindergarten kids in Holland, and half the kids had a nanny who spoke in English to them, and half the kids just watched TV in English every day or whatever it was. And what they found was that the kids that watched TV didn't actually learn any English, but the kids that were speaking to the nanny learned English. And it was because the attention to the stimuli was important, that they had to be interacting with the nanny. And because they weren't interacting with the TV, they weren't actually taking in any of that for intake. So this has sort of been formalized by Schmidt into what's called the noticing hypothesis, meaning if learners are going to change their system, if they're going to restructure their system and not stabilize, particularly stabilize in a fossilized state, which a number of you discussed in your exams, they have to notice the gap. Okay, they have to notice what's different between what they're saying and what a native speaker model is saying or doing, right? And if they don't notice that gap, just giving them input isn't going to change anything, right? So this is one of the reasons, for example, that we can say you get someone living in the US for 10 years and their language doesn't seem to get any better, right? They seem to have fossilized into a certain, well, Schmidt would say that's because they've never noticed the gap between what they're doing and what a native speaker model is doing. So not only do they have to notice the gap, it has to be a conscious noticing. Like they have to say, ah, there's the gap. When I try and say, you know, an indirect relative object clause or whatever, I always put my indirect object in the wrong place. I need to learn to put it, you know. So it really has to be very consciously noted. In other words, it has to be part of their comprehended input. They have to be able to say, I see what's happening, I see where the gap is, I see what I need to do. Now, I don't know if any of you have had that experience in your second language. I have in Hungarian, no question. You have, Mark? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, if you know what you said isn't correct, but you don't know how to make it correct?
Yes, yes, absolutely. You can notice the gap, but it has to form part of your comprehended input, meaning you have to know what to do about it or where to look for what to do about it.
So I got halfway there.
Right. It can't just be like, oh crap, I didn't understand that. I never understand that. And then you move on. Yeah, it has to be something where you're putting pieces of the system together and you say, ah, right, I got it. So again, if we think about us as teachers, what does that mean for us? Well, the one thing we're supposed to do is really work with the gaps. So really present a lot of input on any given thing and say, see, look at what's happening here. So if there is a gap in the system, we can explicitly say to students, this is what you need to do. Now, this is one of the reasons why, you know, you'll start to form ideas in your own mind, if you don't have them already, about how you think people learn language as a second language, particularly as a second language adult. I'm very aware that I'm all the way on the spectrum of second language adults learn language explicitly, you know, and you'll do it quicker if you learn it explicitly. Then you give them the practice to, you know, change that from declarative knowledge to procedural knowledge, so you can actually like come out with it. But that if you don't do it explicitly, you're missing a lot of opportunities for learners to learn. So I know that that's what I believe. At this point, you may or may not believe something, you know, that maybe it's better implicitly or whatever, but you should have an idea of why you believe what you believe, certainly by the end of this. And then working yes.
I got a question.
Yes. Back on
the second part of this notice and hypothesis
must form part of the comprehended input.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that it's just like, you know, the observation from Diego, that it is not easy. It's not applicable to pronunciation.
Well, you and I can go around a few bouts on that one in sound systems. Was I not telling you guys about Shige's dissertation? Was that not you? That was qualitative. Well, we all know Shigehito, right? Well, pretty much everybody here. And for those people at home, Shige is one of our PhD students, one of my PhD students. And I have argued over the years, many years, that this idea that learners will improve their pronunciation just by being like dropped down inside an immersion environment and being part of it isn't necessarily true. I have argued quite strongly that A, there's no reason why it should be true when we think of general second language acquisition theories, and B, no one's ever tested it. So to assume it's true is also a mistake. So Shige, my fabulous PhD student, I'm interested in intonation, prosody, and he did exactly that. So what he did was he took a group of Japanese learners who are in Japan, who have been learning for less than 2 years English and never left Japan. And he took a group of learners who have been here in America for 2 to 5 years, but no longer, and usually, you know, in academic environments. And then he took a third group of Japanese speakers who've been here for over 10 years, right? So they live here, they work here, they whatever. And then he did these tests of their intonation, perception and production. And what he found, among other things, he found many fascinating things, but the one that really sort of made me go, yeah, was the fact that when he, excuse me, when he tested their perception of affect. So that means likes or dislikes. So the test said, listen to this person talking. Do they like this thing or do they dislike this thing? So it will be something like bread. So do you like it or do you dislike it? You like it. Or raisins, which means you dislike it. Right, so these were the kinds of tests. What was fascinating was it didn't matter whether they were still in Japan or whether they had lived here for over 10 years, they all sucked at it. All of them. Native speakers got it 100% right. None of the Japanese groups could read this intonation feature. Not any of them. Okay, so this to me was great. I mean, it's sad in one way, but in another way, I was like, I knew it. I just knew it. Just living in a place doesn't necessarily mean that aspects of your pronunciation either work or don't work. Okay, now I'm talking specifically about one aspect of intonation, which is how you test these things, right? One thing at a time. But obviously my overall proposition would be there's no reason that we need to think of phonology as particularly different than morphosyntax, pragmatics, or semantics. So that's my very long response to that. I think, as with anything else, you've got to notice the gap. And if you don't notice the gap, then you don't learn. Now, of course, from our perspective as teachers and second language learners, this is a bit worrisome, right? Because this is an affective thing. If you're a Japanese English speaker who's living and working in this environment for 10 years, can't tell if something I just said, I liked it or I don't like it, that could be a problem, right? Because he or she might be misreading the cues and the messages that are coming and have no idea they're misreading them, right? So, does that, yeah. All right. Okay, so the next one is working memory, which, as Diego told us, is, quote, those mechanisms and processes that control regulation and active maintenance of task relative information. So the example that Diego gave us was the phone numbers, which is exactly right. So in that case, it's the active maintenance of task relevant information, right? You keep it, you repeat it, and you keep it in your working memory long enough to write it down, and then you let it go. Although that's beginning to become less and less of a good example, because now you just pull out your phone and everybody turns on their, thing. Working memory is also this idea of you can hold 5 to 7 chunks of task relevant information in your working memory at any one time. Any more than that, and your working memory sort of overloads and you start losing. Has anyone ever played Kim's game? You play Kim's game here? You probably have, you just don't call it Kim's game. I have no idea why we call it Kim's game in England, but basically you have a bag full of stuff, and so you put a load of stuff on a table, objects, and then you tell people to memorize it, then you put them all in a bag, and you see how many they remember. Do you have that game here? What's wrong with you people? It's like a game we used to play all the time. Now I'm trying to think why we would, but maybe it was supposed to increase our working memory. I don't know.
I recall there was some children's game that it was not objects in a bag. It was like a display, kind of like a tic-tac-toe display, where different images would appear, and maybe there were 9, or might have been more, might have been 12, but the images would appear, and then you'd have to replicate them in order to get them correct.
Right,
so
right.
You have an analogous thing.
Right. Okay.
I can't remember what it's called.
Right.
I hated it because I was horrible at it.
You were horrible at it.
Yes.
Now you see, it's interesting because we had another game, a card game, which you guys probably have, where you put everything face down, and then you pick it up and you try and match, and you have to remember if 4 is here, you have to remember which of those is 4, and then if you get it right, you get the pair.
That in Mexico.
You have that in Mexico. Do you have that here?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Cards.
Anyway, you would have hated it because you hate that.
Yeah,
so, yeah. So there is a level on which working memory is individually variable. So it may be that your working memory is like not something that you have a happy relationship with.
Not usually, yeah.
My working memory is not good. I used to have to, the only time I got really good at it was when I had to do it for music exams, because in music exams you had to listen to a tune being tapped out, and then you had to tap it back, or you had to listen to a tune being sung and you had to try and sing it back or play it back. So that sort of got me a bit better at it, but yeah. So it can be tested in multiple ways, from simple memorization to repetition to more complicated tasks. Now, you'll be delighted to hear, Mark, that I was going to have you do one of those for the reading post, but I decided against it.
It wouldn't have taken me very long because I wouldn't have been able to do very much.
Right, so I decided against it because it's kind of complicated. But, and also I'm not really sure what I'm trying to prove. You know, working memory is working memory. I mean, I don't, you know. So, phonological short-term memory might be very important. Now, this is where we might come back to Tololupe saying she thinks that phonology is different. But when they're talking about phonological short-term memory, they're not talking necessarily just about phonemic production, but they're talking about the ability to remember the production overall, right? There are also some effects of something called syntactic priming, where if you prime with a certain word, are people going to come back with another word? It's deliberately vague because this is really early stages of this research. It's done in psycholinguistics. Who's done psycholinguistics with Kiki? Who did you do it with? The guy? I
remember it was online.
Yeah, it's
He's an older dude.
Yeah.
He's really good. I liked him.
Yeah, I like him too. He's been our adjunct for a while. Who? Yes, Ed Matai. Thank you. Yes, Ed Matai. Yeah.
I remember his name for another reason. So.
Yeah, Ed Matai. Now, did you do some of this work in Ed Matai's? Did you talk about this stuff? Yeah. Yeah. So those of you that are going to do psycholinguistics with Atado coming up this coming year will probably do some of this stuff too. And it really is about, as I said, probing the brain, trying to find out what makes things. So, for example, we talked last week about individual differences. If there is distinct differences between working memory ability, this could be one of the things, right? That's making some people, even if they're not more successful at learning, they feel better about it because their working memory is better, so they're having an easier time. And remember, we talked about that virtuous circle. The easier time you're having, the more motivated you may be. So that all gets caught up in that loop as well. So, yeah. All right. And then there's this new stuff. And I'm literally just going to say new stuff. Emergentists, constructivists, usage-based, connectionism, frequency models, dynamic systems, which are based on chaos theory. All these are new non-nativist models. So what does that mean when I say new non-nativist models? Have a look at the second point. What's a nativist model? Give me an example.
Chomsky.
Yeah, Chomsky's UG, right? That's a nativist model. That says there's a mechanism that we have as human beings that clicks in and that we can, you know, and it's especially for language. That's especially what it's for. Non-nativist models basically say you don't need to make things more complicated. Is that Occam's razor? You go for the simplest explanation. Yes. I think that's Occam's razor. What these new models say is you can account for everything that's happening in language learning without having to specify a LAD, a particular innate mechanism. You can account for it by just what we can do as human beings as we're growing up with our general cognitive brain. Anybody remember one of the biggest arguments that the nativists used to say we had to have special device?
The lack of the input.
Good. Poverty of the stimulus. You remember poverty of the stimulus? Basically what Chomsky and others said was there isn't enough information and there isn't enough of the right kind of information for kids to be able to do this, right? So that has been really pushed back against by these models. Most specifically, this idea of being able to take out exemplars from the input that children have and creating a system once they recognize those regularities. So again, we're not talking about 4-year-old kids actually consciously thinking, you know, there's a past tense, and, you know, they're doing all this with cognitive mechanisms in their brain. But that those cognitive mechanisms, in the same way that we learn to extract other kinds of regularities, relying on frequency and so on, we can do the exact same thing with language. That's the basic argument. Now, how we do it exactly depends on whether you're a constructivist, a connectivist, a frequency person, a dynamic system. You know, there are certain theoretical differences between these models, but what they all have in common is this idea that you can do it all based on the input, and that this poverty of the stimulus argument doesn't fly. Okay, so if you look on page 280, this to me was the best quote in terms of us being able to understand what it is I'm trying to say. So, yeah, it's right at the top. It's Nick Ellis. Learning, memory, and perception are all affected by frequency of uses. The more times we experience something, the stronger our memory for it, the more fluently it is accessed. The more recently we've experienced something, the stronger our memory for it, the more fluently it is accessed. So that is a connectionism approach. The more that we operate it, the stronger that connection becomes. And also a frequency approach. The more we see it in the input, the more we notice it. These models are pretty recent. Actually, they're very recent. Again, they're not, I have done a little bit on usage-based and frequency, but I know nothing about dynamic systems, which is, for example, Diane Larson-Freeman's idea of complexity theory. Again, if anybody's interested in doing all this, go for it. I am happy to work with you on it. But these are really sort of, you know, if you'd want to take a more specific look at the literature on those particular areas. Sometimes, and I've just sort of thrown this in at the end because you might hear it, although a lot of people hate the term, sometimes it's been called neo-behaviorism. Why might that be, do you think? No, that it's, well, maybe that they hate it, but also why some of these approaches might be termed neo-behaviorism approaches.
Because they're coming out of a general theory of human psychology as opposed to a specific language-focused approach.
That's exactly correct. So, but remember with behaviorism, we started way back with Lado and behaviorism, that the notion of behaviorism wasn't this kind of idea, right? What was the notion of behaviorism?
Behaviorism originally started because if you couldn't empirically measure it, it didn't exist. And that's not the case anymore because obviously there's thinking about language, which is a material thing. So they dropped that. If we can't observe it, it doesn't exist. So it's not strictly behaviorism.
What else? There's another important thing when it comes to talking about behaviorism and language.
I think.
Well,
No?
it's not.
But which one of you was going to go?
Okay. That you can learn it. That there is nothing in here that
Good.
suggested, but that there are stimulus. That once you like a reward thing.
Yeah, stimulus reward. Good.
If
Yeah.
stimulus correct you, then you get it.
Yeah, good. So, good. That's exactly the reason that people don't like this being called neo-behaviorism kinds of ideas, because the behaviorist idea was kind of blank slate, right? And you smack something on it, and the more you put it on there, the habitual it gets, right? This is a completely different idea of frequency. This idea of frequency has to do with neural networks. And basically what they're saying is the stronger you build a neural network, a neural connection between one thing and another thing, the more easily it is accessed. So it's a cognitive model. It's not back to habit formation model. But as Mark says, because in the interim we had that LAD model, nativist model, some people say, oh, well, we're going away from the nativist model back towards a model without a specialized module, which is true, but it's still cognitive model, which the first one wasn't. But you might hear it called that, but don't ever call it that to somebody who does one of these, because they'll be pretty upset with you. Yeah. All right, I think we should take a break because that was quite a lot. So why don't we take a bit of a 10-minute break and come back and we'll do the second half.